On the pod today, we have Adam Serwer, staff writer at The Atlantic, and one of my favorite writers about race and politics in the Trump era. Adam, welcome to the pod.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for that kind introduction.
So you have a piece out this morning about why Ralph Northam should resign, where you say that more is at stake than the governor's career or ambitions. What did you mean by that?
I think that, this is something that's obvious to pretty much everyone, but the social barriers against overt expressions of prejudice have been eroded by the president. They began eroding the second he came down that golden staircase calling Mexicans rapists and murderers. And the only way to repair or ensure that that standard is not further eroded is to hold public officials accountable for that kind of behavior. And I think that's even more important for a party that wants to hold the mantle of anti-racism in the way that the Democratic Party does, and in the way that Northam in particular did when he was running for governor.
Yeah.
So, it's not enough to say, well, it's not like Trump's going to resign. If you want to be a leader of a party which holds itself to a higher standard of behavior than the person that they consider racist who is in the White House, then you really have to hold yourself to that.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, you also write about the difference between interpersonal racism, as you define it, individual acts of cruelty or prejudice, and systemic racism, the embrace of policies that harm people of color. Why do you think that incidents of interpersonal racism, like Northam's picture or Trump's language, tend to get so much more attention and sort of swift condemnation than systemic racism? And what can we do about that?
I'm not sure what we can do about it, sort of having everyone look more closely at the big picture.
Yeah.
But when we're talking about that distinction, I mean, it's just easier to say you used a naughty word and you shouldn't have done that, or you did something that was individually that was racist and condemn that, because it's a lot less scary than really considering the extent to which racism has shaped the American political system and continues to shape it.
Yeah.
And once you get into that, it starts implicating people who may not necessarily have malicious intentions, but are participating in a system and upholding a system that treats people differently according to race. And in the case of Donald Trump, you have someone who, I wrote about this a couple of years ago, who, a lot of people consider themselves anti-racist, nevertheless pulled the lever for Trump because they convinced themselves that he wasn't actually racist, that he cared about everyone, despite policies that he was proposing that, as I list in the piece, have been incredibly discriminatory and have hurt hundreds of thousands of people when you really start looking at the numbers.
Yeah. No, I mean, I thought about this too during the whole Covington Catholic incident, and I was like, we're spending like 4 or 5 days talking about what really happened here. And in the meantime, it did not facilitate a larger discussion about how we treat Native people in this country, which would be a good discussion to have. But it seems like every time there's an incident like this, we can't seem to sort of like broaden the discussion into the larger systemic issues at play here.
I think I think these sort of large symbolic events draw people's attention in part because they feel like the lines are clear. Whereas when you start talking about systemic discrimination, things, particularly for people who benefit from the system, start getting, grayish pretty fast. And
Uncomfortable, yeah.
once that starts happening, people tend to get less strident, which I think is in a way why it's so important for Democrats to draw a really bright line here.
What did you make of how quickly nearly the entire Democratic Party, both in Virginia and nationally, called on Northam to resign?
Well, I think that's a reflection of the fact that the Democratic Party is reliant. It is not viable without black voters. And I think the image of a physician in 1984 possibly wearing blackface, and Northam admitted that he wore blackface in another context, is just evocative of a centuries-long history of black people either being mistreated or being exploited for medical research or being misdiagnosed or not properly treated for medical problems based on beliefs about intrinsic racial differences that don't actually exist. And so I think it was a combination of the sort of the evocation of this form of entertainment that was created in effect to say that black people are happier when they are subservient to subservient to white people, in combination with this history of medical racism in the United States that I think really, I think it just really hit a strong chord with people without whom the Democratic Party simply is not viable. And the distinction between that and, the fact that Steve King is still in office and wasn't censured until now, and the fact that Donald Trump is president is reflective of the fact that there's no constituency of voters within the Republican Party that are willing to punish their elected officials in the same way.
Well, yeah, and you've written about this before too, right? Because it's, the fault line in American politics right now is not tribalism, it's racism, as you've written, right? And this is why there's actually a substantive difference between the two parties and how they deal with these incidents.
And I think you can actually see that on the local level. You can actually see where Republicans are beholden to voters of color. They actually behave kind of differently. And you look at it in Florida where that elections official resigned when he was revealed to have dressed up in a blackface costume, in part because Ron DeSantis is reliant on a substantial constituency of non-white voters for whom, without whom he wouldn't have actually beaten Gillum. So I think that, again, it's about who politicians are beholden to and who their constituencies are. And I think that has a lot more to do with whether people actually get punished for racism or elected officials get held accountable for racism than, whether or not the individual politician is themselves particularly virtuous.
So I wonder how you see this dynamic playing out in the Democratic primary, because I thought it was interesting that on the same day the yearbook photo surfaced, you've got Cory Booker kicking off his presidential campaign, and when a reporter asks whether Trump is racist, he says, well, he says bigoted things and he uses the language of white supremacists, but I don't know the heart of anybody. And then, also interestingly, Sherrod Brown is asked the same question and says, yes, he's a racist. What did you sort of make of those different responses?
I think that Booker's response is reflective of a recognition that you see, throughout the mainstream press and throughout and among a lot of politicians, honestly, Democratic and Republican, that white people are more likely to be accused of racism than suffer from racial discrimination. And as a result, they're extremely sensitive, or not everybody, but a lot of people are very sensitive to the idea that they're going to be accused of being racist when actually they think they're a good person. And I think Booker's remarks are reflective of that concern. He thinks that, in order to appeal to white voters, he has to avoid a situation in which he appears to be labeling a large chunk of the electorate as racist. And for whatever reason, Sherrod Brown is less concerned about that. And I don't know if that's because he feels that he is accountable to a set of voters who are going to forgive him for that, or his presidential ambitions aren't fully fleshed out, or I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But I do think that the reality is that white people are the demographic majority, and their concerns are going to have an outsized influence on the way that we talk about racism.
Yeah. I just wonder if there are white voters out there who, if you say that Trump says racist things and does racist things, that will give them a different impression or somehow influence their vote differently than if you say Trump is racist. I just don't know how much that distinction matters, but maybe it does to some people. I don't know.
Well, something that I thought about when Booker said that was to what extent he feels like, as a black candidate who's trying to appeal to those Trump-Obama voters, whether he can, he can, in a sense, reassure those voters that he's not judging them by talking about racism, honestly, in a way that reminds me of the way that Obama talked about it.
Totally. That was my first thought. I mean, Obama was very careful to, like, I don't think Obama would have called Trump a racist, to be perfectly honest.
And I think that, you know, Brown may feel more comfortable doing that because he's a white guy.
Yeah.
But I don't. But you know, I wouldn't necessarily say that those actions are predetermined based on race. I mean, I don't recall what Kamala Harris has said about it, but you know, I don't think it's necessarily the case that a black candidate has to be like, well, I don't know what's in their heart, but I do think that the political calculation may be a bit different because of that.
Yeah. So last question. Stacey Abrams is going to be delivering the Democratic rebuttal on Tuesday. She recently wrote a pretty forceful essay for Foreign Affairs about how identity politics actually strengthens our democracy. And she said that she makes the argument that her diverse coalition in the 2018 Senate race was built by understanding each group's unique concerns instead of trying to create what she calls a false image of universality. What did you think of that piece?
I thought it was a great piece.
Yeah.
I am not from Georgia, and obviously I followed the Georgia race, but I'm not. You know, I'm not a Stacey Abrams expert, but I thought that piece was extraordinarily perceptive about what conservatives call identity politics actually is, which is marginalized people who formerly did not have a voice, demanding the same rights as everyone else. Yeah. And that's generally what people mean when they say identity politics, and it's a kind of denigration of those people's vital interests. And I think Abrams is fundamentally right that it's about expanding democracy, not constricting it.
Yeah. No, I thought you made a very persuasive case, too, that part of the problems with calls for more universality and sort of a message that appeals to everyone at once is that it sort of ignores the historical discrimination that's not too far in the past at all, legally, that all kinds of different minority groups have faced in the country.
I also think that you can find the universality in the specific. Mm-hmm. You know, talking about, I mean, I think Obama was pretty good at this. You know, he cast his unusual heritage as a uniquely American thing, and I'm not necessarily sure that's the case. But what he did was he made that story universal in part by being so specific and talking about the values that he inherited in his unusual family that were reflective of, you know, the way that people raise their kids everywhere. So I think there's a way to be both universal and specific at the same time, and I think that to the extent that there's a barrier in seeing those certain stories as universal because they're specific, it has a lot to do with not being able to relate to people who are unlike you.
Yeah, but you're right. I mean, Obama tried to root his unique story and his differences in the American story. You know, this is fundamentally American, and no other story is no other country on earth is my story even possible. Right? Would be the line. Adam, thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate you chatting with us. Yeah, and come back again soon. Take care.